Thank you. My name is Vern Jones. I'm the publisher and producer at Principia Media. It's been my pleasure to work with Joe Koenig for the last 4 years. And I just want to give a little bit of history to those of you who may not know D.B. Cooper or may have forgotten something, or a refresher for the rest of you. On Thanksgiving Eve in 1971, a man walked up to the Northwest Orient counter in Portland, Oregon, and purchased a ticket to go to Seattle, and he gave his name as Dan Cooper. Now later, as this was reported, local newspaper reporters in Portland thought it was definitely the Dan Cooper was a famous minor criminal in the Portland area, and his name was D.B. Cooper. And that name actually stuck and stayed with him to this day. So he purchased the ticket, got on the plane. Shortly after takeoff, he handed a note to the stewardess that said, "I have a bomb. Please come sit by me." He then made his demands, $200,000 in an unused currency. He wanted 4 parachutes, which is unusual for a hijacking. Then he also demanded that the plane fly at a certain altitude, lower than 10,000 feet, at about 200 miles an hour. And after the plane landed in Seattle, he wanted them to take him to Mexico, and he released the passengers at that point. Shortly after the plane left Seattle, the pilots felt a bump in the back of the plane, and D.B. Cooper was never seen or heard from again. We believe until last May. In 2016, January 2016, almost 3 years ago today, we were approached by a gentleman who was a prospective author that had a manuscript, and basically his story to Dirk Wierenga, my director of publishing, was this guy believes his friend was D.B. Cooper, and he has a lot of evidence to prove that. Dirk told me about the interview, and I said, "You don't believe this nut job, do you?" And after I talked to Carl, he clearly isn't a nut job. He's a very intelligent man, very accomplished man. But when I kept talking to him, he said, "I need you to come and see my evidence." And the evidence he had was overwhelming for us. So that was the beginning of a 2.5-year investigation, because we were very skeptical, like most people should be. I literally am not a conspiracy theorist, and I just couldn't believe it. So we literally went through all the facts, all the stories, all the information that Carl had, and we started a 2.5-year investigation. Walter Recca was his friend's name. Walter was more than qualified to be Cooper. He more than met all the qualifications the FBI had set up for D.B. Cooper. They said he would be desperate. Walter told his niece the reason he hijacked the plane was because he said, "I'd rather be dead than poor." He was daring, they said. Well, Walter had already robbed a big boy. He was out on bail. He also had a couple of other armed robberies, so he definitely had the daring part. They said he's a unique parachutist with survival skills. Walter was very accomplished in the military. In addition to being a paratrooper, he enlisted in the United States Air Force Reserve, where he was a rescue and survival specialist, which is the most difficult specialty in the armed forces, I am told. And he matched the physical descriptions that the FBI had given. So we went through our evidence, and our evidence started out with a 14-year confession. From 1999 to 2014, Carl and Walter had weekly conversations, sometimes multiple times a day. This was not a deathbed confession. This was 2 people talking about what this man had accomplished through his life and the things that he had done. In 2008 and 2009, Carl said, "I need to record some of this." So he began recording them. So we also now have 3.5 hours of audio tape of this discussion between these 2 men. And so I'd like to play a little bit of you, and it'll actually start right about the time, just at the time where Walter, or Cooper, shows the bomb to the stewardess.
Walter built a realistic-looking bomb using 6 road flares, a battery, and wires.
How did you hook up the wires to the flares?
Yeah, you could see wires. I had tape around them right there, and I had the wire bent in as if it was going to a fuse. And the things on the bottom right there were just sticking around like a nail.
Yeah.
I had them cut off.
When you rode on the bus from Spokane to Portland, you wouldn't have been wearing your insulated underwear then, would you?
Yeah.
Even on the bus?
Yeah.
So you didn't need to have any other kind of a bag or suitcase or anything?
No. I got the underwear still. The bottom piece wouldn't fit anymore.
When when you got there, do you remember anything you did while you were there? You probably had a couple of drinks.
Yeah, I had a couple of drinks right there, and then I figured I better get right there because I don't want a hangover. I just want a clear head. Didn't have that much, and I still didn't know if I was going through with it.
What was your last day like before you went out to Portland Airport? Did you sleep that night, or were you restless and tossing in bed?
I had a hard time going to sleep, but I went to sleep. Yeah, because I said, I don't have to do this. I mean, there was two people in my head, The left shoulder would be the devil, the right shoulder would be the angel. The devil made me do it.
So you took the shuttle to the airport. Had you checked on the airlines that you were going to get prior to arrival, or playing it by ear?
Playing it by ear, that's all. Yeah, there was no plan, no nothing. I mean, really nothing. You read about it in the paper, this was clever and that was good. There wasn't a thing clever about the whole deal.
At the airport, did you see anybody there that was unusual?
No, I was hunched in the corner. I would be the only person who would be unusual out of that whole bunch. And I always thought people were staring at me.
Around noon, Walter arrives at the airport, buys a $20 ticket one way to Seattle. He signed in as Dan Cooper, a name the media changed to D.B. Cooper.
Did you know what kind of airplane you were getting on?
No. There was no planning to anything.
Well, how did you know that there was a door and a tail that went down then? Because that was only on one airplane.
Everything's real vague.
It was sheer luck that because of Thanksgiving traffic, nobody was sitting in his row.
You had that seat all to yourself. There were only 35 people on the airplane.
Walter boarded the plane at 1:45.
What if they would have assigned you a seat and there would have been a guy sitting right next to you? What would you have done?
I never thought that far ahead.
Just getting the empty row of seats was just the luck of the draw.
Yeah.
At 2:05, the airplane took off as scheduled. He was sitting in the back row and the flight attendants were sitting right behind him. He had a typed note in his pocket, but he decided to write a new note to simplify instructions. The handwritten note said, "Miss, I have a bomb. Sit next to me."
You took off out of Portland and you ordered a drink, or you lit a cigarette.
I always liked cigarettes.
How many packs of cigarettes did you have?
Oh, I must have had less than a carton. I'd say maybe 8 packs.
Now, where would you have put them?
In my pockets.
Now, where did you carry your note?
Inside pocket of the suit.
At 5 minutes into the flight, Walter handed his note to flight attendant Flo Schaffner. Thinking the note was personal, she put it in her pocket.
What was the note about?
I can't remember right there. This is a hijack and I've got explosives.
After reading the note, Schaffner does come and sit beside Walter, and he shows her the bomb.
When you gave that note to the stewardess, was that the hardest thing that you had done so far? Because that starts the whole thing.
That committed me.
Yeah, you know, you were always saying, well, I could back out. By the time that you did that, backing out was getting a little bit late right then.
Walter instructs Schaffner to tell the pilot that the plane has been hijacked.
So you did hand her the note, and since she kind of put it in her pocket, like she said, I can't believe you're actually hijacking this airplane.
And I says, I can't believe it either, but I'm serious.
All right, yes, that was from D.B. Cooper, The Real Story, the documentary that we produced at the end of our investigation. In addition to the evidence that we had that you just saw, we had an eyewitness that actually saw Walter within an hour of the plane leaving SeaTac. He assisted him in providing directions, and he remembered him to this day. He had a confession to not only Carl Loren, the author, but also to his niece Lisa, his sister, and Carl's wife Loretta. We actually provided DNA directly to the FBI in this case, and they had a very peculiar response that takes a while to explain. We know where the landing spot was, and we know where the money went. So when we began this investigation, it was basically Dirk and I and Irene and Julie and Carl, of course. But we knew that we didn't have the skills to take to actually carry this through. And that was when I was fortunate enough to have already worked with Joe Koenig. Joe was uniquely qualified to do this particular work. He's retired Michigan State Police. Walter spent most of his life in the Detroit area. Joe was very familiar with that area. Joe was also the lead investigator in the Hoffa disappearance. So he was familiar with working with really high-profile cases. He has 45 years of experience as an investigator, and we literally needed those skills and the access he had to information. Joe is the former president of the Michigan FBI National Academy Association. He's a certified fraud investigator, which helped us look through the diaries that we had with all the bank account numbers and contacts that Walt had throughout the world. Most importantly, he is a forensic linguist, which you'll hear about in a second because that was key. Most of our evidence was the conversations like you just heard. It was interviews with witnesses. It was interviewing with Carl, with Loretta, with his niece. And we're trying to find out, I said, Joe, you've got to find, are these people telling the truth? And I'll let Joe explain to you what his findings are. So at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce a very good friend of mine and one of the gifted investigators in the country, Joe Koenig.
Wonderful job, Vern. Wonderful job. Thank you for coming, Director. My favorite director in the state police.
Happy birthday, Joe.
Thank you, sir. Only 73 today, Tommy. I remember this guy. When I was at Michigan. His brother and I were not roommates, but right across the hall, and he took me to his Detroit home, and Tommy was running around in socks, probably about, 12 years old or something. Yeah. Well, in any investigation, good investigators will look at the details because the details really solve the case. And in this case, that's what happened. Yes, I did forensic linguistics, which involves really looking very closely at details, but it's details like that the FBI reports don't reveal that I think will eventually have the FBI reopen their case and solve it, because I do believe that Walt Recca is D.B. Cooper. Details like how his attitude on the plane to the stewardesses, how polite he was to the stewardesses, the fact that he was planning on going out the side door until the stewardess pointed out the rear door. When he landed, broke his leg on a tree in a field near Cle Elum, Washington. And that was nothing new to Walt. He had broken his legs several times in the past by jumping. Matter of fact, he jumped one day, broke his leg, and the paratroop team wanted to go up again. He said, I'm going up again too. And he did a second jump with a broken leg. This guy was borderline crazy. The details, when he landed, he talked about how he took his parachute off, put it on the ground, and then covered it with branches. And then took his raincoat, put the money into the raincoat, wrapped the raincoat around the money, put it under his arm, and then walked toward the lights that he had seen just before he landed. As he's walking down this road, when it's rainy, dark, cold, I mean, it was nasty that night. There's a dump truck drives by him. That dump truck was driven by, we later learned, was Cowboy. So Walter walks on up to this cafe that he sees in the distance, and he sees this guy he describes looks like a cowboy in the restaurant. So Walt orders a coffee. The cowboy has a coffee, and Walt gets up. There's a rotary dial phone on the wall at this Teanaway Cafe. He calls up who we later learned to be Don Brennan, an old friend of his, and tells him, I did it. And Don is half in the bag as usual, and he said, did what? Anyway, he said, hold on, and he asked Cowboy to give Don Brennan directions on how to get to this cafe, because Walt had no idea where he was. So Cowboy did, asked him where he was coming from. Don said, Seattle area. And he said, well, come down the Blewett Pass. And then Cowboy finishes up. Walt buys his coffee, and then Cowboy goes on to give a concert at the Grange Hall. He's a singer, and a pretty good one, by the way. So it's the details, again, that really solve this case. So as I go through, I'll point out some of those in some of these slides. The guy in the middle there is Carl. Carl, Charlie Brown in the tape, that's how he was known to the parachute group. Charlie Brown was a highly respected member of the parachute team. Everybody who knows Carl knows he's genuine and knows he's truthful. He's a good man. He's a commercial pilot, and he has run a couple successful businesses, but a very good man. That's his wife, Loretta, next to him. So when I go into Florida, I flew into Florida with Vern to interview Carl to get a feel for his communication patterns. Nothing better than being in person so you can see how he forms his words, how he breathes, how his any voice inflections, how he pronounces words. Does he react to questions right away? How's the pause time? All of those things I look for when I'm trying to calibrate to a person's communication patterns. And then I look for changes in those patterns, which could be an indication of they could have an emotional thought just swept through their mind. Could be a noise happened in the room. Could be all of a sudden they remembered they had to do something, and also it could be deception. Something causes that communication pattern change, and that's what I look for in forensic linguistics. Forensic linguistics is using communication or language as evidence. Unabomber case is a good example of that. The FBI finally convinced the Unabomber to put out a manifesto, and when he did that, it was published, and the Unabomber's brother read that, and he recognized some of the language and phrases that sounded familiar to what language and communication patterns his brother used to use, which were kind of unique. He thought about it for a long time and then went to the FBI. And then the FBI put a forensic linguist on this, and the forensic linguist made sufficient comparisons and showed sufficient consistency to authorize a search warrant for this Unabomber's cabin, and that's what solved the case. So that forensic linguist really solved that case. So we look for communication patterns. You calibrate to the individual. So when I interviewed Carl, I calibrated to Carl. I also calibrated to listening to the tape recordings over 3.5 hours. I listened to that many, many times. My wife, Julie, 47 years, by the way, was instrumental in allowing me to do that, because we got an initial transcription, and then later she had to refine that many, many times, put in well over 100 hours in refining that to bring it up to my standards that I needed so that I could see and rely on some patterns that were in that. So I listened to the audible, tried to get a feel for communication patterns. How quickly did he answer questions? How did he pronounce his words? What was the volume? Any inflections in his voice at any particular times? And then once I calibrated to him, then I looked for those changes, and I listened to those tapes many times, spent a lot of time on it, and I never found a significant communication pattern change throughout the entire tapes. And the transcripts bore that out. Eventually, I was able to analyze these transcripts. Here's some of the analysis. So this is about words, basically, that are very important to me. I'm a wordsmith. So we're looking for pronouns. What I do, the very first thing I do when I do a linguistic analysis is I circle all the pronouns. I underline all the articles, a and the, because those in and of themselves can break a case for you. They're talking about a gun at one time, and now it's the gun. There's a difference. So you look for those things. You start asking yourself on each and every word, why did they use that word? Why did they use that word at that time and not a previous time or a later time? So you ask a series of questions on each and every word that's given. Now when you have an audible, you have additional variables there you can look at. And when you're in person, then you're just bombarded with a stream of information that makes it, actually there's more information than you can handle, but you do your best to get a lock on their communication patterns. Body language comes into play at that point. All kinds of things. Pronouns are very important. Matter of fact, through pronoun analysis alone, I find deception in 80% of the time. When I find deception, it will reveal itself in their pronoun use, how they changed their pronouns, for example, or how they used pronouns. Pronouns like I promote precision. There's only one I, very specific, very precise. So I look for that. Truthful people promote precision. They want you to know the truth, so they volunteer it. Deceptive people, on the other hand, promote obfuscation. They want to muddy the waters. They want to confuse you. They don't want you to know the truth. So here's how I began. There's 104 pages of transcripts right there. You can't see it, but each and every pronoun and every page is circled. Every article is underlined. There are, where there are special phrases, double underlined. It's all color-coded. And what I do, the first thing I'll do is look at that on the floor, and I'll look at it for hours to see if I see patterns, pronoun patterns, specific unusual words or phrases, patterns. I'm looking for patterns. And what I found in these transcripts was the I pronoun was homogeneously found through all the pages of this transcript. And that's just Walt's verbiage, by the way. I analyzed primarily Walt's verbiage in this. So I found pronouns throughout the transcripts, but the I pronoun in particular. That tells me he's taking accountability, responsibility for what he's saying. Nobody else is saying it, he's saying it, and he's owning up to it. That's a good sign, okay? If he uses they or I think or something like that, then it takes on less value, but pronoun use is very important. I also found in here, this is a word count of all of Walt's words that he used in the transcripts. That which is shaded more dark are the more common words used. Would, like, I'm, but, don't, you know, right there. The I 748 times. I like contractions. I like it when a subject uses contractions. Contractions, if I was in the state police and I was writing a special report, which I did, to Colonel Davis, you wouldn't find many contractions in that because it's a formal document. You know, I'm pleading mercy. Here's what I did. Please spare me, you know. It's very formal. Whereas in an informal situation, you can find these contractions. So I look for contractions. Contractions to me are a signal, not necessarily definitive, but it is a pattern that you can see when people are talking informally under less stress. If you're telling a lie, you're under more stress than if you're telling the truth. If you're less stressful, you're more likely to be telling the truth. So it's just an indicator, but contractions are important to me. So, but one thing that was really unique was Walt's use of right there. He used it 214 times. He would say, I got it right there, and I said it right there. I mean, 214 times he uses that phrase. Now, you know is also used frequently, but Carl contaminated that use of you know, at least in my mind, because he used it first and he often used it in his questions. So I disregarded the phrase "you know." But that was also in there. Walt used that phrase quite a bit. But there was sufficient contamination by Carl that I didn't feel I could rely on it. So right there, I look at that. And again, like the discussion on contractions, there's a lower level of stress. Less stress, you'll see more informal language. So that's another good indicator. Now, what was also a good indicator, in my book, I separate the discussions where Walt is talking about the hijacking, which should be more stressful than when he's talking about the weather. So I compare the times I see right there in pronouns in those stressful situations and take a look at the less stressful situations. And his use is consistent, whether it's talking about the hijacking or talking about the weather. That's important. No communication pattern change. So I'm seeing consistency throughout this whole discussion. We have, in addition to my book and Carl's book and the film documentary, you can listen to the Audible. And I dare you to say that Walt isn't consistent throughout that. I mean, he is really convincing. He's kind of self-deprecating. I mean, he's very calm, matter of fact. When he can't remember, he'll say it. When he's got details, more so than what Carl asked, he'll offer those details, which is also an important sign, because investigators love those details. That's what separates a good investigator from a bad one. In this case, Walt, after the hijacking, he bought a house in Spokane, had an address. Dirk looked it up on Polk. He found out, hey, there it is. There's the address, and then Dirk found the owner of the home that Walt bought it from. Dirk interviewed him, got a videotape. I'm looking at videotapes of this guy, of Jeff Osadich, who is now known as Cowboy, and videos of Carl. So I've got a lot of good information here based on some of their work. They talked to this homeowner, and he said, "Yeah, I remember Walt. He was a very nice guy. He bought the house on a land contract." He said, matter of fact, he paid cash for it. He said, "Actually, I only accept cash. I don't accept checks, so I only accept cash," so it wasn't unusual for Walt to pay in cash. But it's those kinds of details that we end up corroborating. The interview with Cowboy, I mean, his account for what happened that day is a mirror image of what Walt told us. It's incredible. Now, Cowboy isn't just a singer in a band. He's a former police officer. He remembered that Walt had loafers on, penny loafers. Why? Because when I was a kid, I wanted penny loafers. I just noticed it. So, good man, and real, very, very credible. If you see the videotape, which you'd see on the documentary, you would agree. So here's some of the analysis. Here's the right there. So Walt, no, right there in Spokane, right there. You leave it in the lot. See, Walt drove from his home in Heartline, drove his car to Spokane, parked his car in a bus parking lot there, then took a bus to Portland. Now he did that because nobody'd be looking for a car in Spokane, but they'd be looking for a car in Portland. So he went from Spokane in a bus to Portland, describes being on the bus with a lady with a child, even helped the lady. He held the bottle for the baby. I mean, he gave details. That's what I look for. In my book, all the pronouns aren't circled, but they are italicized. So you'll see all the pronouns, they're all italicized. When you see in my book a border around, that means there's an admission within that border, okay? So it's important. He's not only talking about this stressful situation, the hijacking, because it's shaded, but there's an admission in there. The difference between an admission and a confession, in case you don't know the difference, an admission is an admission, you're admitting to an element of a crime. There are usually 4 or 5 elements to a crime. A confession has all the admissions to all the elements of the crime, so it's important. Confessions are really important, and that's actually what drove all my good endorsements from all the prosecutors and police officers who reviewed it, and almost all of them recommended that the FBI review this case because it's solved. Here's one, this is interesting to me, in an FBI 302 report. You all may not know, the FBI never records their interviews. It's an unusual policy, and they still don't today. So every FBI report is a recantation or a something the FBI remembers what the subject told them. That can be very, very difficult for a linguistic guy like me. I mean, if they put it in quotes, then I'm seeing what the guy actually said. But if they're recharacterizing important words, then I miss that. But in this case, here they're talking about the hijacker was instructed by the stewardess on lowering the rear passenger door while the aircraft was in flight. See, the FBI has released a lot of documents. I'm almost certain they've got more documents that have these detailed conversations wherein the stewardess will say, yeah, the guy wanted to go out the side door, and I told him, well, why don't you go out the rear door? And it's that kind of thing that'll break a case. Nobody but the stewardess, the crew on the aircraft, and the hijacker would know that information. The FBI's got it, and all they have to do is buy my book and take a look. Here's some things I do with analysis. I will take important words. This is analysis of Cowboy's statement. Excellent statement. No question he's telling the truth. No question in my mind. And finally, a very important point for an investigator, of all that evidence that I looked at over 2 years, I never found anything that was a significant contradiction to what Walt told us. Never. And I looked for that. There it is. I appreciate you coming out. Let's open it up to questions. Anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, Joe, in terms of he broke his leg or his ankle.
Broke his
Did
leg.
the cowboy have anything to say about the fact that...
No. And I couldn't ask him because that would contaminate it. But he didn't. He didn't say anything about a limp, as far as I know. But Walt's a tough guy. Cowboy said he wanted to pick him up, but the company policy wouldn't allow him to do that. Plus, he didn't have a front seat, he said. So he drove right by him, went in to have coffee, and then after that, went on to do his concert at 9 p.m. at the Grange Hall.
That the FBI will reopen so that they can close it finally?
Well, I hope so. That was part of the strategy in getting some of these FBI people to endorse my book, review it and endorse it, because, I mean, if they look at current McCabe of the FBI is saying, hey, this is good stuff, maybe they'll look at it. But they have said they've suspended their case. They've said they won't open it unless they find a parachute or money. And by the way, Walt died in 2014. I don't think did we bring that up?
If they were to reopen it, would the friend Don Brennan be an accomplice to the crime?
Don Brennan is dead. I suppose there still could be some money out there. Now, Walt took his money across into Canada. In those days, you could just walk across into Canada. I mean, there was no big deal. And he put his money into a Canadian bank. I mean, we even talked to bankers about, hey, these bills, the FBI, they gave you a list of all the serial numbers, these $20 bills, and asked them to look for them. Banks don't have time to do that, especially in those days. There's no computer. DNA, we talked about DNA before. DNA evidence can be very easily contaminated and make it render it worthless. Walt smoked Raleigh cigarettes, and they had 8 Raleigh cigarette butts that they removed from the plane where the hijacker was sitting. That's their best evidence. Now, how they preserved it or how they kept it, because DNA wasn't even known at that time. So, and again, if you don't store it correctly, you'll ruin it. It'll contaminate. Turns out they've apparently lost those cigarette butts. So, things happen, right, Director?
Never happened in MS.
No. You know, a lot of unanswered questions, but in my mind, there's no question this is D.B. Cooper. Yes, sir.
Joe, have you looked into, or have you applied any of these techniques into the accounts, as in, I heard you paint houses?
Oh, no, I haven't, but I'm pretty sure that's not accurate. You know, I'm in the book, by the way. Have you seen it? I just can't think that the mob, as good as they were with as notorious a guy as Jimmy Hoffa was, that they would have risked driving several miles down Woodward with Hoffa in the car to this home. And besides, I have a pretty good idea of what happened anyway. And it wasn't that. Yeah, that's an interesting book. I heard they paint houses. You know what that means, right? All of you?
Did you read the book, Joe?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't know if I read the whole thing.
I know it.
Yeah, I'm in
I
there.
read it.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, Halverson called me up right in the middle of that investigation. George Halverson was a director just before you, two before you. Hoke. Anyway, he was a director in '75, and he calls up, and here I've missed 3 midterms in college. It's our wedding anniversary. Julie hasn't seen me for 4 days. I finally get home, and here it is. The colonel's on the phone. He said, "Joe, how you doing? Yeah, this is Colonel Halverson. Have you taken Hoffa's car, measured the gasoline in it, and compared it to what should have been in it to what was in there now to get a feel for how far he drove?" And I said, "No, sir." But it was a good idea. At any
I
rate,
wonder who told him to call you.
I don't know, but it was kind of funny. Yeah,
Does this have anything to do with yours?
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's their documentary, our documentary. I'm in there. So, okay. Well, thank you all very much. I appreciate it.
Enjoyed it, Joe.
Excellent.